The air at the Hemlock Farm auction tasted of dust, rust, and finality. It was the taste of a life's work being scattered to the four winds, sold by the pound and by the acre. Arthur Miller stood near the back of the crowd, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his worn denim jacket. The familiar weight of a few carefully folded $100 bills, a small comfort against his thigh. He wasn't here for land. He couldn't afford to be. He was here for ghosts. For the discarded iron that might hold a bearing, or a gear he could use to keep his own aging machinery alive. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a sweat-stained Stetson, was working the crowd over the last prime parcel, 80 acres of black Iowa dirt that lay flush against Art's own fence line. "I've got 200 an acre. Do I hear 210? 210? Yes, sir, the man in the back. Now 220. Who'll give me 220 for the prettiest piece of ground in Grafton County?" A hand shot up from the front. Richard Peterson, all shiny boots and confident swagger. He'd shown up in a brand-new Ford F-250 that still had the dealer's paper plate in the rear window. "250, Rich's voice boomed, cutting through the auctioneer's chatter. He wanted to end it, to show everyone he wasn't here to haggle. A murmur went through the crowd. $250 an acre was top dollar, a price that made old men whistle and shake their heads. Art felt a familiar tightening in his gut. It was the same feeling he got when he saw lightning on the horizon during harvest. Rich was farming on paper, on banknotes and projected yields. Art farmed on soil, on what he could pay for in cash. The auctioneer tried to find another bidder, his eyes scanning the faces of men who had farmed this county their whole lives. He found only downcast eyes and grimly set jaws. "Sold to Mr. Richard Peterson for $250 an acre." Rich beamed, shaking hands with the banker who materialized at his elbow as if summoned. He clapped the man on the back, laughing. "You gotta spend it to make it," Art heard him say. "Land's the only thing they ain't making more of." It was a line he used often, a bumper sticker philosophy that sounded good but ignored the fine print of a variable interest rate. Art turned his attention away as the auction moved to the machinery line. It was a sad collection. A rusted-out Farmall H with one flat tire, its engine likely seized from sitting. A New Holland baler with broken tines grinning like a gap-toothed old man. Art picked up a few sets of wrenches and a heavy-duty chain, paying cash and loading them into the bed of his beat-up Chevy C10. He was about to leave when the auctioneer gestured toward the collapsed remains of the main barn. "All right, folks, we got one more item back here. Not sure what old man Hemlock was thinking, but it's got to go. We're selling it for scrap where it sits." A few curious farmers followed him, tucked behind a wall of rotted timbers, half swallowed by overgrown thistle and sumac, was the unmistakable shape of a pull-type combine. It was a McCormick Deering No. 64, a relic from the 50s. Its red paint was faded to a dull, chalky pink, blistered with rust. The canvases were rotted away, and a bird's nest was tucked into the grain auger. It sat on two massive steel wheels, sunk a good 6 inches into the soft earth. Rich Peterson, walking by on his way back to his truck, let out a loud laugh. "Well, I'll be. A real museum piece. What are you going to do with that, Earl? Make a mailbox out of it?" He called to the auctioneer. The auctioneer, nonplussed, just started the chant. "All right, what am I bid for this piece of history? Give me $20, just $20 to haul it away." Silence. No one wanted the hassle. It would take a cutting torch and a flatbed just to get it off the property. $10. Come on, boys. The scrap value alone is more than that. $10. Art stepped forward, his eyes tracing the lines of the machine. He saw past the rust and the rot. He saw the heavy-gauge steel of the frame, the simple, robust design of the threshing cylinder. There were no complex hydraulics, no delicate electronics. It was a machine built of iron and ingenuity, something a man could understand, something a man could fix with his own 2 hands. His father had run a machine just like it, pulled by their old Farmall M. He remembered the smell of the canvas and the rhythmic clatter that meant they were making money. Real money, not bank money. $50, Art said, his voice quiet but clear. The auctioneer's head snapped in his direction. Rich Peterson, who had been about to climb into his truck, stopped and turned, a look of genuine disbelief on his face. $50 from Art Miller. Do I hear 60? 50 once, 50 twice. Sold. To the man with more patience than sense. The small crowd chuckled as they dispersed, leaving Art alone with his prize. He walked up to it, laying a hand on the cold, rusted sheet metal of the grain tank. It was solid. He kicked one of the huge wheels. The tire was shot, but the rim was good. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could make it run again. Rich Peterson strolled over, shaking his head. "Art, what in the hell are you going to do with that thing? It's an anchor. You'll spend more on diesel just dragging it home than you paid for it." "It's good steel, Rich," Art said, not looking at him, his eyes still scanning the machine. "They don't make 'em like this anymore." "You're damn right they don't," Rich scoffed. "My new 7700 can cut more in an hour than that thing could do in a day." "It's called progress, Art. Efficiency, you're living in the past." Art finally turned to look at him. He saw Rich's expensive shirt, his clean hands. "My past is all paid for, Rich. How about your future?" A flicker of annoyance crossed Rich's face before he covered it with a dismissive smirk. He clapped Art on the shoulder. "You're a piece of work, Miller, a real piece of work. Good luck with your project." He turned and walked away, the crunch of his new boots on the gravel sounding loud in the sudden quiet. Art watched him go, then turned back to the combine. The first problem was getting it home. The main axle was frozen solid. He drove his old Chevy back to his farm and returned with the big tractor, his John Deere 4020. It wasn't new, but it was the newest thing he owned, bought with 10 years of saved crop money. Its diesel engine settled into a reassuring throaty idle as he backed it up to the combine. He hitched the heavy chain he'd just bought to the tongue and took up the slack. He eased the clutch out, and the 4020 dug in, its rear tires biting into the dirt. The chain went taut as a guitar string, groaning in protest. The combine didn't budge. It just sat there, a stubborn monument of rust. Art shut the tractor down and sighed. This wasn't going to be easy. He spent the next 2 hours with a can of penetrating oil, a 3-pound sledgehammer, and a long breaker bar, working on the hubs. He soaked every bolt, tapped every seam, trying to break the bond of 20 years of rust and neglect. The sun beat down on his back, and sweat dripped from his nose, making dark spots in the dust. Finally, with a sharp crack that echoed across the empty farmstead, one wheel broke free, then the other. It was a small victory, but it was a start. He hitched it up again, and this time, with a great groaning and shrieking of tortured metal, the old McCormick lurched forward, leaving deep ruts in the ground where it had slept for 2 decades. The slow, arduous journey home had begun. Now, before we get into the grease and the busted knuckles of bringing this old ghost back to life, I gotta ask you all something. Have you ever bought something everyone else called junk, knowing you could make it sing again? Let me know down in the comments what it was. A car, a tool, a piece of equipment. I read every single one. Getting the McCormick combine back to his farm was one thing, bringing it back to life was another entirely. Art parked it behind his machine shed, where it listed to one side like a wounded animal. For the rest of that summer and fall, it became his obsession. After the crops were in, after the evening chores were done, and his wife Mary and the kids were settling in for the night, Art would walk out to the shed, flick on the single bare bulb that hung from a rafter, and go to work. The first step was demolition. He tore out the rotted canvases, the crumbling wooden slats of the draper, the petrified leather belts. He shoveled out a decade's worth of caked dirt, chaff, and the mummified remains of mice and birds. The smell was thick and musty, the smell of decay. But beneath it all, Art could smell the faint metallic scent of good iron. He spent a week just freeing the sieves and straw walkers, which were rusted into a solid mass. It was a brutal, thankless job that involved torching, hammering, and prying. Each bolt was a battle. He'd heat it cherry red with the oxyacetylene torch until it glowed like a coal, then quench it with penetrating oil that hissed and smoked, and finally put the full force of his weight on a 4-foot breaker bar. Sometimes the bolt would surrender with a satisfying crack. More often, it would shear off, and he'd have to drill it out and re-tap the hole, his knuckles raw and bleeding from the effort. The coffee shop crowd at the Grafton County Co-op had found their new favorite topic. Here Art Miller's still out there banging on that old Thresher he bought, one would say over a steaming mug. "My boy drove past his place last night," another would add. "Said he was out there with a torch at 10 o'clock. Looked like a war was going on. What's he think he's going to do with it?" "Same thing his old man would have done," a third would grumble. "Pinch a penny so hard the eagle screams." Meanwhile, Rich Peterson just cleared another 100 acres. That's how you get ahead. Rich, of course, fueled the talk whenever he could. He'd sit at the main table, holding court, talking about his new John Deere 7700 combine with its air-conditioned cab and hydrostatic drive. "It's about bushels per hour," he'd declare. "Time is money. While Art's out there tinkering with a relic, I'm putting grain in the bin. You can't make a living with scrap iron." Mary heard the whispers when she went to town for groceries. She saw the sideways glances, the pitying smiles. She supported Art, she always had, but she was worried. She'd bring him a hot thermos of coffee late at night, her face etched with concern in the harsh light of the workshop. "Are you sure about this, Art?" she asked one night, watching him meticulously clean a set of bearings in a can of kerosene. "You're working yourself to the bone." He looked up, his face smeared with grease, but his eyes were clear and determined. "This machine put food on the table for a family once, Mary. It can do it again. It's honest. There's no banker's name on it." His biggest challenge was the threshing cylinder. The heavy grooved bars were worn down and several were bent. A new one was out of the question. They hadn't made them in 15 years. So Art became a scavenger. He drove to 3 different farm junkyards in neighboring counties, walking through acres of mechanical skeletons, looking for another dead McCormick. He finally found one, flipped on its side in a ditch, and spent a whole Saturday pulling its cylinder. It cost him another $20 and a case of beer for the yard owner. Back in his shop, he painstakingly rebuilt one good cylinder out of the 2, checking the balance with a string and a plumb bob, filing the bars until they were true. He ordered new canvases from a specialty supplier in Kansas and spent 3 nights riveting on the new wooden slats, his hands cramping from the repetitive work. He replaced every belt, every chain, every grease zerk. He sandblasted the rust off the main body and gave it 2 coats of International Harvester Red, not because it needed to be pretty, but because a man takes pride in his tools. By the following summer, it was ready. The machine gleamed under the July sun, looking not new but renewed, resurrected. Art greased every fitting one last time, filled the wheel-bearing caps, and hitched the combine to his 4020. He pulled it out to a 5-acre patch of oats he'd planted as a test. He climbed into the seat of the John Deere, took a deep breath, and engaged the PTO. The long drive shaft began to spin. A low rumble started from the combine, then a clatter, then a rhythmic thrumming roar as all the chains and belts and walkers came up to speed. It was a mechanical symphony, a sound no one had heard in this county for 20 years. He eased the tractor forward, lowering the cutter bar into the standing oats. The sickle began to chatter, the draper canvas began to turn, and the golden stalks disappeared into the machine's gullet. Art watched, his heart in his throat. He drove 50 feet and stopped, shutting everything down. He climbed off the tractor and ran to the back of the combine. On the ground was a neat trail of straw. He walked to the side and looked in the grain tank. There, gleaming in the sunlight, was a small pile of clean, perfect oat kernels. It worked. A slow smile spread across Art's face. It was a deep, quiet satisfaction that no bank loan could ever buy. Just then, he heard the roar of a much bigger diesel engine. Rich Peterson was driving down the county road on his new John Deere 4430. Its enclosed cab a bubble of air-conditioned comfort. He was pulling a massive 24-foot disc that made Art's own equipment look like toys. Rich slowed as he passed, looking at Art and the old McCormick. He didn't stop. He just shook his head slowly, a pitying smirk on his face, and then throttled up, the big tractor leaving Art and his resurrected machine in a boiling cloud of road dust. The message was unmistakable. You're still a joke. The next few years were a blur of hard work for Art and a rocket ride for Rich Peterson. The mid-1970s had arrived, and with them, the biggest agricultural boom in living memory. The Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest, signed a massive grain deal with the United States. Suddenly, America was the breadbasket for the world, and the price of corn and soybeans shot into the stratosphere. A farmer could get $3, even $4 a bushel for corn that had been worth a little over $1 just a few years before. Land values followed suit, doubling and then tripling. It was a gold rush, and the black dirt of the Midwest was the motherlode. Rich Peterson rode the wave like he was born to it. He leveraged his initial 80-acre purchase to buy another 160. He used that as collateral to buy 300 more. The bankers at the First National of Grafton County loved him. He was their star client, a visionary, the new face of American farming. He traded in the John Deere 7700 after only 2 seasons for a brand new International Harvester 1460 axial flow, a revolutionary machine that could chew through corn faster than anything anyone had ever seen. He bought a second big 4-wheel drive tractor, a Steiger, to pull a 12-bottom plow. His farmstead transformed. A new sprawling ranch-style house went up, complete with a 2-car garage. Next to it, he erected a massive Morton machine shed, a gleaming steel cathedral to modern agriculture that could hold his entire fleet of new green and red iron. His wife drove a new Lincoln Continental, and Rich himself traded his Ford for a new one every 2 years. He was the king of Grafton County, and he made sure everyone knew it. He'd hold court at the co-op, dispensing wisdom. "You gotta be big to survive," he'd say. "Go big or get out. The bank's giving away money at 8%. It's practically free when land is going up 20% a year." Art Miller watched it all with a steady, cautious eye. He too was benefiting from the high grain prices. His yields were good, a testament to a lifetime of careful soil stewardship. But he didn't follow Rich's path. The windfall from his crops went to one place first: the bank. He took every extra dollar and threw it at the remaining mortgage on the original 240-acre farm his father had bought. In the fall of 1976, he walked into the bank and made the final payment. The bank president, a man who fawned over Rich Peterson, barely looked up as he stamped the paperwork. For him, a paid-off loan was a lost customer. For Art, it was freedom. He was 42 years old, and he was 100% debt-free. He owned his land, his house, and every piece of machinery on his farm, lock, stock, and barrel. He put the rest of his profits away. Some went into a savings account, earning a modest interest. The rest he reinvested in the farm itself, but not in expansion. He tiled a wet patch in the back 40, a long overdue improvement. He built new fences. He bought fertilizer and lime, feeding the soil that fed him. He kept his machinery in perfect repair. The 4020 got a complete engine overhaul, which he did himself over one long winter. The old Farmall M still ran as sweet as the day it was made, and for the harvest he still used the McCormick No. 64. It was a point of ridicule across the county. While Rich's 2 massive combines, with their air-conditioned cabs and stereo systems, could clear 200 acres in a day, Art was out there on the open seat of his 4020, dust and chaff flying, slowly working his way through 20 acres, maybe 25 if he ran from sunup until well after sundown. He had to stop every hour to grease a fitting, to check a belt. He had to shovel the grain out of the small onboard tank into a wagon by hand. It was slow, grueling work. The talk in town had shifted from amusement to a kind of frustrated pity. "It's a damn shame," they'd say. "Art's a good farmer, but he's got no vision. He's leaving a fortune on the table. With corn at $4, he should be farming fence line to fence line, not tinkering with that old relic." One afternoon at the grain elevator, as Art was waiting his turn in a long line of trucks, Rich pulled up beside him in his gleaming Peterbilt semi. He rolled down the window. "Art, I just don't get you," Rich said, shaking his head. "You're working yourself into an early grave for what? You could be doubling your operation every 2 years like I am. The bank is practically giving money away. What are you so afraid of?" Art looked at Rich, at the tired lines around his eyes that even his success couldn't hide. He looked at the massive gleaming truck that cost more than Art's whole farm had just 10 years prior. "I like to sleep at night, Rich," Art said simply. "I own my land. I own my machines. What the bank gives, the bank can take away." Rich threw his head back and laughed, a loud booming sound that turned heads. "You sound just like your old man. Scared money don't make money, Art. You'll see. In 10 years I'll own half this county, and you'll still be polishing that rusty old combine." He rolled up his window and pulled onto the scales, the sheer weight of his load making the scale house tremble. That winter, as a blizzard howled outside, Art was in his shop, listening to the late-night news on the radio while he replaced the sickle sections on the McCormick's cutter bar. A man's voice, calm and resolute, cut through the static. It was an economist, talking about the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker. "Volcker is a different breed," the voice said. "He believes the runaway inflation of the past decade is the single greatest threat to the American economy. He has stated, in no uncertain terms, that he will use the full power of the Fed to break its back. He's talking about a new era of monetary discipline, even if it means raising interest rates to unprecedented levels." A cold feeling, colder than the wind rattling the tin roof of the shed, crept into Art's gut. Interest rates. To him it was just a number on his savings account statement. But to Rich, and to thousands of farmers like him, it was a lifeline that was about to be pulled taut. Art looked around his shop. He saw his 4020, its engine rebuilt and strong. He saw the Farmall M, a testament to 50 years of reliability. He saw the old McCormick combine, its new red paint gleaming under the single bare bulb. They were his, all his. He thought of Rich's massive fleet, 2 farms over, gleaming under mercury vapor lights, each machine bearing the invisible brand of the First National Bank of Grafton County. The wind howled louder, a low moan that sounded like a warning. A storm was coming, not a storm of snow and ice, but one of dollars and cents, of decimal points and due dates. And Art Miller suddenly felt like the only man in the county who had bothered to build an ark. The first sign of trouble wasn't a thunderclap. It was a slow, sickening fade, like the color draining from an autumn sky. The year was 1980. The headlines were full of talk about Afghanistan, hostages in Iran, and a peanut farmer in the White House who was telling people to put on a sweater. For the farmers of Grafton County, the news that mattered came crackling over the radio during the morning market report, a full grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The single biggest customer for American corn and soybeans was gone overnight. The price at the elevator didn't just drop, it fell off a cliff. Corn that had been flirting with $4 a bushel was suddenly struggling to fetch $2. The gold rush was over. That summer the sky turned against them too. The clouds that gathered on the horizon were full of dust, not rain. Day after day, a relentless sun beat down, baking the black soil into a cracked grey plate. Corn leaves curled inward, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture, turning the fields a sickly pale green. By July, the talk at the co-op was no longer about buying more land. It was about whether there would be a crop to harvest at all. Art Miller felt the squeeze like everyone else. He watched his corn struggle, his heart aching with the silent, helpless pain only a farmer can know. But his worry was different. It was the worry of a bad year, not the terror of total ruin. He had no payments to make. The only interest he was concerned with was the kind his savings account was earning at the bank. For Rich Peterson, the situation was catastrophic. He was leveraged to the hilt, with mortgage payments on over 1,000 acres and operating notes on $500,000 worth of machinery. His entire empire was built on the assumption of high yields and high prices. Now he had neither. The banker, Mr. Henderson, who used to drive out to the farm to admire Rich's new equipment, now called him on the phone every Friday. His voice, once full of encouraging bonhomie, had taken on a hard, clinical edge. The harvest that year was a grim affair. The yields were down by half. The meager rain that finally came in late August was just enough to keep the combines from starting fires in the tinder-dry fields. Art fired up the John Deere 4020 and hitched up the old McCormick. Its rhythmic clatter seemed louder in the strained quiet of that autumn, a steady mechanical heartbeat in a world that was having a seizure. He worked his fields slowly, methodically. The small grain tank meant he had to stop often, but it also gave him time to check the machine, to listen for any change in its song. It never missed a beat. 2 farms over, Rich Peterson's harvest was a frantic, desperate race against the bank. He was running his massive International Harvester 1460 from before dawn until long after dark, pushing it to its limits. Then, one afternoon, in the middle of his best remaining field of corn, it happened. A high-pitched squeal, a shudder that ran through the whole machine, and then a deafening bang, followed by the sound of grinding metal. The giant rotor at the heart of the axial flow combine had seized. Rich climbed down from the air-conditioned cab, his face ashen. A cloud of oily smoke billowed from the engine compartment. He knew instantly that this was not a simple fix. The dealer mechanic arrived 2 days later, his truck leaving a plume of dust down Rich's long gravel driveway. He took one look, shook his head, and delivered the verdict. A main rotor bearing had failed, taking the shaft and a good part of the housing with it. The parts alone would be thousands of dollars, and they were on back order. It would be 3 weeks before he could even think about fixing it, and his repair schedule was already booked solid. 3 weeks. In harvest time, that was an eternity. Rich stood in his field, surrounded by a sea of dying corn, and looked across the fence line. He could hear it, faint but clear on the autumn air, the steady, unchanging clatter of Art Miller's antique combine, still working, still putting grain in the wagon. The sound that had been a joke for years now sounded like a judgment. The cracks in Rich's empire were no longer hidden. They were splitting wide open for the whole county to see. He had to make a call to a custom harvester from another county, a man who charged a fortune per acre just to get the rest of his ruined crop out of the field before winter set in. It was another expense, another wound in a year that was already bleeding him dry. That winter, the final blow landed. Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve, in their war on inflation, drove interest rates into the stratosphere. The prime rate, the number that governed every other loan, climbed past 15, then 18, then an unthinkable 20%. For farmers like Rich, who had bet everything on variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. His payments didn't just go up, they tripled. The 8% free money he had bragged about was now a monster eating his farm alive. The early 1980s descended on the heartland like a plague. The word on everyone's lips was foreclosure. Farm auctions, once a place of community and opportunity, became funerals. Neighbors stood in grim silence, their hats in their hands, as families they had known their whole lives watched their heritage sold off piece by piece to satisfy the banks. The auctioneer's chants sounded like eulogies. Rich Peterson fought it for as long as he could. He sold his wife's Lincoln. He sold the big Steiger tractor. He sold a prime 80-acre parcel for less than half of what he had paid for it just a few years earlier, the cash disappearing instantly into the black hole of accrued interest. But it was like trying to bail out the Titanic with a bucket. The land values had collapsed along with the crop prices. He was upside down, owing far more than his entire operation was worth. The day the notice was nailed to his front door, the sky was a cold, unforgiving gray. The First National Bank of Grafton County was foreclosing on the Peterson farm. All of it. The new house, the massive machine shed, the 1,000 acres he had fought so hard to acquire. Even the original 80 acres his grandfather had homesteaded. The auction was set for a Saturday in March. The wind had a bitter edge to it, whipping across the bare fields. The crowd was large but subdued. There was no swagger, no confident bidding. It was a gathering of survivors and vultures. Art Miller was there, standing near the back, just as he had been at the Hemlock auction all those years ago. But this time, the feeling in his gut wasn't caution. It was a profound sadness. They sold the machinery first. The gleaming International 1460, its rotor finally repaired, went for a quarter of its original price. The Peterbilt Semi, Rich's pride and joy, was bought by a trucking firm from Des Moines. Art watched it all, his hands in his pockets. He didn't bid. He wasn't there to pick at the bones. He bought only one small item, a heavy-duty floorjack that he knew Rich had prized. He paid $20 for it. Then came the land. Parcel by parcel, Rich's empire was dismantled. The crowd was thin. The only real bidder was a man in a suit representing an insurance company, an out-of-state corporation that saw the land as just another number on a balance sheet. Rich stood beside his wife near the new house he had built, his face a stony mask, but Art could see the tremor in his hands. He looked like a king watching his kingdom burn. Art, meanwhile, was weathering the storm. The low grain prices meant his income was down, but his expenses were a fraction of what his neighbors were paying. His fuel bill for the 60-horsepower 4020 was minimal compared to the thirst of a 200-horsepower Steiger. When a sickle bar on the old McCormick broke, he didn't call a dealer, he welded it himself in his shop. When the canvas draper tore, he didn't replace it. He patched it with a needle and waxed thread, a skill his father had taught him. He was a self-contained island of solvency in an ocean of red ink. He dipped into his savings to pay his taxes and buy groceries, but the principle remained untouched. He was surviving, using the old skills, the old tools, the old ways that Rich and so many others had dismissed as obsolete. He was living proof that the tortoise, slow and steady, sometimes did win the race. The final parcel to be sold was the original 80 acres. It included the old farmhouse Rich had grown up in and the small, weathered barn where he had raised his first 4-H calf. It was the heart of it all, the piece of ground that held his family's history. The auctioneer started the bidding low. The man from the insurance company raised his hand. The auctioneer looked around. No one else moved. This was it. The Peterson legacy was about to be swallowed by a corporate ledger. "I've got $100 an acre from the gentleman in the suit," the auctioneer called out, his voice flat. "Do I hear 110? Silence. The wind whistled around the corner of the big machine shed. Rich closed his eyes. 150, a quiet voice said from the back of the crowd. Every head turned. It was Art Miller. His face was calm, his expression unreadable. The man in the suit looked annoyed. He conferred with someone on a cell phone the size of a brick, then nodded to the auctioneer. 160. 200, Art said immediately, his voice stronger now. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't scavenging. This was a fight. Rich opened his eyes and stared at Art, his expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. The corporate buyer bid again. Art countered instantly. They went back and forth, the price climbing in $10 increments. The crowd watched, spellbound. It was more than an auction. It was a battle for the soul of the county. Finally, the price reached $300 an acre, a fair price but far from the inflated highs of the 70s. The man in the suit shook his head and turned away. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking through the cold air. "To Arthur Miller for $300 an acre." Art didn't smile. He walked to the clerk's table, pulled a checkbook from his jacket pocket, and wrote out the down payment from the savings account he had so patiently fed for the past decade. He had just spent a significant portion of his life's savings, not on a new tractor or a bigger farm for himself, but on his neighbor's birthright. Later that afternoon, after the crowds had gone and the last of the equipment was being hauled away, Art found Rich sitting on the steps of the old farmhouse, the only thing that was still his until the bank officially took possession. The new ranch house across the yard was already empty, a hollow monument to a shattered dream. Art walked up and sat down on the step below him. Neither man spoke for a long time. They just watched the sun dip toward the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of purple and orange. "Why, Art?" Rich finally asked, his voice thick with emotion. "After all the years I gave you hell, laughed at your combine, called you a fool. Why?" Art looked out at the 80 acres of black dirt stretching before them. "Because this land has your name on it, Rich. Your grandfather broke this prairie. Your father survived the Depression on it. It shouldn't be owned by some company in Chicago that's never seen a planting season." He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. It was a simple, handwritten lease agreement. "I'm going to need someone to farm this place for me," Art said, not looking at him. "Can't handle it all myself. The rent is $1 a year. You can live here in the old house. You can use my equipment until you get back on your feet. The plows, the planters, even the old McCormick if you want." Rich stared at the paper, then at Art. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He just nodded, his shoulders shaking as the weight of years of pride and pressure finally broke. For the first time since he was a boy, Richard Peterson cried. Art sat there beside him, a silent presence, as the last light of day faded from the Iowa sky. The years that followed were quiet ones. The farm crisis slowly receded, leaving deep scars on the community. Many families were gone forever, their names fading from the mailboxes at the end of long gravel lanes. but Grafton County endured. The talk at the co-op changed for good. The swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. They talked about input costs, about soil health, about fixing things yourself. They talked about Miller-style farming. Art never held court, never said, "I told you so." He didn't have to. His life was his sermon. He became a pillar of the community, not because he was rich, but because he was steady. Men came to him, hat in hand, asking to borrow a welder or seeking advice on how to rebuild a transmission. He always helped. Rich Peterson, humbled and stripped of his ambition, rediscovered himself on those 80 acres. He became a farmer again, not a CEO. He learned the rhythms of the seasons, the feel of the soil. He and Art worked side by side, two old rivals who had become something closer than friends. They were survivors. One year, Rich bought the 80 acres back from Art, paying him exactly what Art had paid, with a handshake sealing the deal. Art grew older, his hair turned the color of winter wheat, and his hands, gnarled from a lifetime of work, were like maps of his journey. He never bought a new tractor. The John Deere 4020 remained his workhorse, and every fall he would pull the old McCormick No. 64 out of the shed. It was dented and its paint was faded again, but it ran as true as ever. One crisp October afternoon, Art was out in a field of soybeans with his grandson, a boy of 12 with his grandfather's clear, steady eyes. Art was showing him how to grease the fittings on the combine's main drive. "Grandpa?" the boy asked, wiping grease from his hands with a red rag. "Why do we still use this old thing?" "Dad said Mr. Peterson has a newer combine now, and it's way faster." Art stopped turning the grease gun and looked at the boy. He pointed to the faded McCormick Deering logo on the side of the grain tank. "See that?" he said. "That machine doesn't have a bank's name written on it anywhere. It's ours. It asks for nothing but grease, fuel, and a little patience. It won't ever make you rich, but it will never make you poor either." He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Remember this. The land isn't a commodity, it's a trust. You don't own it. You just take care of it for a while, and you never, ever bet the trust on a roll of the dice. You build slow, you stay humble, and you pay your own way. That's how you last." Later that evening, as the sun set, Art climbed onto the seat of the 4020 one more time. He engaged the PTO and listened as the old combine spun to life behind him. The rhythmic, familiar clatter filled the air, the sound of shafts turning, of chains moving, of straw walkers dancing their age-old jig. It wasn't the roar of progress or the hum of efficiency. It was a different sound altogether. It was the sound of freedom. The steady, unbreakable heartbeat of a life well lived, a legacy secured not in acres but in wisdom. And as he lowered the cutter bar into the golden soybeans, he knew it was a song that would echo across these fields for generations to come.